Chapter 2. Michelle. The members of the press were gathering in the hall, while Richard made his way toward his private dressing room. He paused with his best photographic smile, prompting a surge of camera flashes, then quickened his pace so he could return to them as soon as possible. If there had been anything other than his precious violin in his hand, Richard would have dropped it when he flinched. Is it her? Richard was visibly shaking. It can't be. Yet there she was, eagerly talking with the reporters. She was facing the other direction, yet her stylish white purse, the light brown curls, and the flowered summer dress were unmistakably hers. As her name began forming in Richard's mouth, she turned. Totally out of character for Richard Gaspar, he anxiously blurted out, "Michelle!" as she squarely faced him. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. "Who is Michelle?" came a different voice than he had expected to hear. The woman looked like Michelle, but her eyes and mouth were those of a stranger. Richard cringed. The press pass on the bodice of her form-fitting dress glimmered in the light, and she lifted her notepad along with a fine felt-tipped marker. Richard had been caught off guard, and a quick recovery was necessary before he had to answer any unwanted questions from the young reporter. His face brightened as if animated by a switch. "Michelle is my cousin from Greece," he lied. "I haven't seen her in almost 3 years. You look just like her." With his captivating smile and an excessive amount of suave, he added, "She's a beautiful woman. I thought she had come to surprise me at the end of my tour." It didn't take long for the attack mode expression to dissipate and for a friendly smile to replace it in response to Richard's flattering words. Julia Rice, a veteran columnist whose every feature was in sharp contrast with the young woman's, briskly stepped forward. It was obvious from the tone in her voice that the information she was offering was merely out of professional courtesy. "Let me introduce Janice Perry to you, Richard. She is the youngest critic ever to work at the Herald." Julia had not been kind to Richard's cause over the years, and her eyes narrowed to mere slits. "I'm breaking her in and showing her the ropes." Richard's eyebrows raised. "Breaking her in?" Julia hesitated just long enough for Richard to bite his tongue. He knew better than to confront a critic, especially Julia Rice, and he quickly added with as much sweet, frothy icing as he dared, "Tell me, how do Herald's youngest and most distinguished ladies of culture respond to my performance this evening?" Unlike her naive, starry-eyed counterpart, Julia had the ability to ward off any amount of insincere flattery, and she coldly turned toward Janice with a face of stone. All earlier signs of affection quickly left Janice's face, and with an expression that looked rehearsed, she smugly replied, "We don't usually discuss our opinions before going to press, Mr. Gaspar, but for you we will make an exception." She lifted her notepad and declared in a lofty tone, "A fitting performance to end the latest tour of Gaspar." "Fitting?" Richard burst out. He stared at Janice, speechless, then glared toward Julia, who he knew had really penned the words. "What do you mean by fitting?" Richard was no longer able to restrain his emotions. "Would you prefer predictable?" Julia replied. There was a noticeable chill in the air, and after an awkward moment of silence, Janice continued, "An air of virtuosity, yet lacking full expression." Julia and Janice exchanged evil smiles and sly winks as Richard struggled to recover from the impact of her words. "What more do you want?" he asked in a sincerely hurt tone. Julia raised her hand. the hand that Richard knew could elevate his career to new heights or instantly crush it with a stroke of her pen. With an outgoing circular motion of her fingers, she announced, "Technically perfect, but I've had better." Julia and Janice lifted their noses and walked away laughing. Before Richard's jaw could resume its normal, upright position, both critics had retreated into the noisy crowd. Richard was stunned, and "technically perfect, but I've had better" grated on his oversensitive nerves until his inflated ego became raw and festered. He responded by strutting into his dressing room and defiantly raising the lid of his violin case so he could finally put his instrument away. Julia loved teasing Richard like that, and he knew that her review in the morning would be kinder than Janice's notes had just indicated. Yet he also knew that her words would still lack the high praise and enthusiastic adjectives he so desperately craved from her. While trying to clear his mind and regain his composure, Richard realized that he was staring at his violin. It had been made by Carlo Bergonzi in 1720, and even though it was one of the violin maker's finest works, Richard knew that it was still categorized below the more famous instruments of Antonio Stradivari and Joseph Guarneri. It had served him well over the years, but he found that it no longer satisfied his needs. He had continued playing on the violin longer than his professional savvy should have allowed him to, but he had his reasons. They were sentimental reasons, and Richard Gaspar didn't have many sentimental reasons in his life. Julia's statement weighed so heavily on his mind because he knew that it was time to get an instrument that could deliver more. Is that what she meant? He wondered. Remembering some of Julia's earlier critiques that couldn't be blamed on his instrument, Richard clenched his jaw. What does she know anyway? Even though Julia Rice represented the top of her field, she was still just one critic. Most of the others adored Richard, and they all wrote the words he wanted to hear. Yet he was torn. Was there more that he or his violin could give? Not just intonation and volume, but something more? Richard's gaze wandered across the surface of his Bergonzi, and he froze. There was an old scratch in the violin's belly, and it all came rushing back to him. Michelle, the girl he thought he had just seen. The noise of the crowd fell silent while her name lingered in his mind, and Richard opened a small compartment in his violin case without a conscious effort. He pulled out a soft cotton cloth and carefully unfolded it. Even after all the years that had passed, he couldn't forget Michelle, and her memory kept him from ever loving anyone else. Richard dusted the rosin off of his violin while contemplating Janice. She was a fine-looking woman and seemed nice, in spite of the words that Julia had told her to say. Then he shook his head. No, women may look right. Even more importantly, they may act and talk right, but they simply are not right. They're not Michelle, and they never will be. Richard passed the cloth between the strings and fingerboard 2 additional times. He had never been forced to add so much rosin before. With Michelle, there was more, much more, and Richard knew that less would never do. Even though the crowd was becoming impatient, Richard touched the scar on the old violin's belly and gently lifted it against his cheek. The damage had been done the day that he met Michelle Ross, and he found himself struggling to hold back the tears. He was 13 years old. Richard was in the study of his parents' luxurious home, practicing his arpeggios with his closest friend, a large black metronome. His parents had mortgaged the small mansion the year before because Richard had been playing over 4 hours a day and needed an instrument that could be used for a professional solo career. His mind was keenly focused, and his fingers had been flying across the silver-wound strings for over 2 hours. He was relentless and would never go on to the next piece or exercise until each note had been played flawlessly from memory. It was early in the afternoon, and the doorbell had sounded only moments before. His mother was talking with someone in the entry, but as usual, Richard ignored her and kept practicing. Elaine would have normally closed the study door in an attempt to not interrupt his practicing, but this time it remained open. Interesting, Richard thought, after noticing that Elaine was talking in the voice she only used when addressing small children. Richard finally heard the large front door swing closed, so he put his mind fully back into his studies with the metronome constantly clicking away at 120 beats per minute. After hearing the scamper of small clawed feet on the hardwood floor, Richard looked down at a furry face scurrying in his direction at full speed. He instinctively pulled the bergonzi under his arm, yet he wasn't fast enough. His eyes opened wide as the sharp metal edge of his music stand teetered over and bit into the belly of his violin. Richard stared down in shock, then up angrily into the eyes of an 11-year-old girl with light brown hair. She eagerly lifted the dog in her arms and held him up so Richard could admire how cute he was. Even though Richard was only 13 years old, he could instantly tell by her plain clothes and simple smile that she was not from a wealthy family. He could also tell that she had no idea what her little animal had just done to his valuable violin. It only took a second for Richard to fill his lungs and yell at the top of his voice, "Look at what you've done! Look at my violin," he continued, "my bergonzi. Do you have any idea what this violin cost?" Richard scowled fiercely and began gritting his teeth. She instantly looked hurt and apologetic. "Are you going to pay for this?" he demanded, after holding the violin in front of her face so she could inspect the damage. "Who are you, anyway?" he viciously barked, while bringing his nose down next to hers with as much hate in his eyes as a 13-year-old boy could possibly muster. She backed away with her large chestnut eyes opening wide. She was small for her age, and Richard moved forward until he was intentionally looming over her. When the little girl tried smiling again, Richard snarled. She pursed her lips together, and in an effort to protect herself, she raised the little dog in front of her face as large tears filled her big, soft eyes. Richard watched in amazement as they burst out and ran down her cheeks in waves. Even though she was quivering in fear, Richard violently shook his violin and began yelling again. With a look of terror and confusion, she turned and ran across the hardwood floor, her ruffled white socks and shiny black shoes moving as fast as they could. She passed Elaine in the entry at full speed and only hesitated long enough to swing the heavy oak door out of her way. Richard followed quickly behind and stepped out onto the front porch, just in time to see her trip and stumble down the stairs. He snickered when her knees hit the concrete, and laughed out loud after seeing her tender skin savagely torn by its rough, unforgiving surface. She tried to protect the helpless puppy by lifting her elbow, but the little dog yapped as she sprawled out, face down on the ground. Everything went silent, and she lay completely motionless, with her short pleated skirt up over her back. Richard flinched, realizing how badly she might be hurt, but then furrowed his eyebrows and decided to wait. Without ever letting go of her dog, the little girl moaned and lifted herself up to a sitting position. She pulled her skirt back down with a trembling hand and sobbed uncontrollably after seeing large drops of blood falling from her arm. Elaine arrived at Richard's side as the little girl looked up with a pathetic plea for help. Richard responded by shaking his violin. "Get out of here!" Terror seized her tiny frame, and she frantically struggled to her feet. Both of her legs were shaking, and she could barely stand. Yet, with Richard's further encouragement, she ran as fast as she could. After taking a few more steps, her feet got tangled in each other, and she fell again, prompting yet another laugh from Richard. Elaine stared at Richard in shock. But before she could say anything, the little girl had shuffled down the sidewalk, out of sight.